The morning ritual. The sun had not yet risen over the small town of Portland. When Martha Jenkins opened her eyes, the air inside her modest kitchen was cold, the floor creaking softly under her slippers. Every morning for 10 years, she had followed the same rhythm, a quiet routine that gave her life meaning. She tied her faded apron around her waist and reached for the pot she always used to cook stew. Steam soon began to rise, filling the air with the scent of vegetables and beef bones. The rhythmic sound of the ladle striking the pot became her morning song. She hummed an old church hymn, the one her late husband Thomas used to whistle while fixing his tools. The walls seemed to echo with his memory, wrapping her heart in both warmth and loneliness. She carefully packed sandwiches into brown paper bags. Each bag had a small note inside, handwritten with a short prayer. "May you find comfort today," she wrote in her fragile handwriting. Then she placed them neatly into a basket lined with a red cloth. Outside, the mist rolled in from the river, turning the streets silver gray. She wrapped her scarf around her neck and stepped into the morning cold. At the train station, the same faces waited, tired, hungry, and grateful. The men and women greeted her with smiles that carried both shame and hope. "Mornin', Miss Martha," someone called. She smiled gently. "Good morning, everyone. Eat while it's still warm." Her voice, though frail, carried warmth stronger than any fire. She moved from one person to another, handing out food and blessings. Each thank you felt like a heartbeat keeping her alive. And then, she saw him sitting alone at the far end of the bench. He was different from the others. His jacket, though old, was clean, his posture, upright, his silence, heavy. She walked toward him, holding out a sandwich. "Here you go, dear," she said softly. He lifted his eyes for just a moment. "Thank you, Mom." His voice was low and steady, like someone who once gave orders rather than received them. Their eyes met briefly, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. When he reached for the food, his hands trembled slightly. Martha noticed the tremor, the scar near his thumb, the gentleness in the way he handled the bread. It reminded her of someone she once knew, her son, long gone, who had the same quiet hands. She smiled faintly, brushing away the thought. The train rumbled behind them, shaking the ground as it passed. The sound always made her heart ache. Every whistle of a departing train reminded her of the day her son left home, angry and young. After everyone had eaten, Martha sat on a nearby bench. Her legs ached, but her heart felt light. She watched as the quiet man, the one called David, she would later learn, folded the paper, wrapping carefully, as if respecting the food itself. No one else did that. He stood up, nodded once toward her, and disappeared into the mist beyond the tracks. She stared after him longer than she should have. Something about his back, broad yet weary, seemed painfully familiar. When she returned home, she placed the empty basket on the counter. Her cat rubbed against her leg, purring softly. She poured herself tea and looked out the window. The fog was lifting now, revealing the town's rooftops and church steeple. She whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me strength again today." Her eyes fell upon a photo frame on the wall, her husband smiling beside a young boy. She touched the glass gently. "I hope he's eating well, wherever he is." Outside, the church bell rang in the distance, marking another morning gone. In the quiet that followed, she sat still, her heart both heavy and at peace. She didn't know that the man she fed today would soon change everything she believed about loss and forgiveness. But for now, she was simply Martha, the grandmother, who fed the forgotten, one meal at a time. The collapse. The rain had begun before sunset, soft at first, then relentless. The town emptied quickly, umbrellas dotting the streets like dark blossoms. Martha Jenkins, wrapped in her old raincoat, walked her usual route toward the station. She never skipped a night, no matter how bad the weather. Her basket was lighter now, only a few sandwiches left for the stragglers. The air smelled of iron and wet pavement, thick with November chill. When she reached the corner near the platform, she saw him. David lay slumped against the wall of the ticket booth, motionless. His face was pale under the dim streetlight, lips blue from the cold. The rain poured down his shoulders, pooling at his feet. For a moment, Martha froze, her heart hammering. Then instinct took over. She dropped her basket and ran to him, kneeling in the puddles. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. His breathing was shallow, ragged. The other passers-by hurried past, pretending not to see. "Help! Please someone!" she shouted, but no one stopped. A car slowed, then drove away. Martha realized she was alone. She looked back at David, his eyelids fluttering faintly. With surprising strength for her age, she lifted him under the arms. Her joints screamed, her breath came in gasps. Step by step, she dragged him through the rain-soaked alley. The basket lay forgotten, its contents dissolving into the gutter. By the time she reached her porch, her clothes were drenched, her hands numb. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, and half pulled, half carried him inside. He collapsed onto the couch, barely conscious. Martha shut the door, shutting out the storm's roar. The ticking clock was the only sound left in the room. She rushed to the kitchen, filling a pot with water. Soon, the smell of warm broth filled the air. Her trembling hands ladled soup into a bowl as thunder rattled the window. When she returned, David stirred. His eyes opened slightly, dazed and glassy. Martha placed a towel on his forehead, whispering, "You're safe now." He blinked, trying to speak, but no words came. She helped him drink a few spoonfuls of broth. The color slowly returned to his face. He looked around the small room, his gaze landing on the framed photos above the fireplace. A younger Martha, her husband, and a smiling boy with dark hair. David stared for a long time, his lips parting in a faint gasp. Martha followed his eyes, a strange chill running through her chest. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Inside, the house felt both too quiet and too full of ghosts. When David finally drifted into sleep, Martha sat nearby, exhausted but alert. Her knees ached, her breath came in slow shudders. She looked at the sleeping man, the stranger she had pulled from the storm. Something about his face tugged at the deepest corners of her memory. She touched the edge of his blanket and whispered, "Rest easy, dear." Lightning flashed across the room, illuminating his profile for a moment. In that flicker of light, she saw not a stranger, but something heartbreakingly familiar. She drew in a sharp breath and crossed herself. Outside, rain continued to pour, washing away 30 years of silence. Whispers in town, the snow melted into muddy puddles along Main Street, and with it came gossip. At the grocery store, 2 women whispered near the produce aisle. "Did you hear? Martha Jenkins took in a homeless man," one said. The other sighed, shaking her head. "At her age? That's dangerous." By the end of the day, the whole town knew. Rumors drifted through church pews, barber chairs, and diner booths. Some called her charitable, others called her foolish. Martha heard every word, but she didn't flinch. Each morning, she still walked to the station with her basket. David followed a few paces behind, carrying extra blankets. The others in the homeless crowd teased him for living with the saint. He smiled awkwardly, saying nothing. When Martha handed him his meal, the others noticed she always gave him an extra portion. The jokes grew louder, and she ignored them with grace. The quiet between them said more than gossip ever could. In town, people watched from behind windows, as David repaired fences and cleaned gutters. He worked hard, accepted little, and never asked for payment. Children liked him, adults avoided him. One boy waved and shouted, "Mr. David." And he waved back shyly. Even Martha's neighbors, Mrs. Harlan and Mr. Cooper, began to soften. Still, whispers followed her wherever she went. "Why let a stranger stay in your home?" they asked. Martha only smiled and replied, "Because no one else would." Her voice carried no bitterness, only truth. On Sundays, she brought David to church. When they entered, a hush swept across the room. The congregation exchanged uneasy glances. Pastor Miller, kind and gray-haired, welcomed them warmly. After service, David stood by the memorial wall, tracing the names etched in brass. His fingers stopped on one Thomas Jenkins, beloved husband and father. He stared at it for a long time, unmoving. Martha's breath caught as she approached. Before she could speak, he whispered, "Your husband was a good man." His tone was reverent, almost personal. The words pierced her heart. She wanted to ask how he knew that name, but fear stopped her. He turned away, heading for the exit, shoulders heavy beneath his coat. She watched him go, a strange ache blooming in her chest. The pastor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "God tests the brave, Martha," he said quietly. She nodded, forcing a small smile. Outside, The wind howled through the empty street. Snow began to fall again, covering footprints one by one. Martha looked toward the direction David had gone. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain. The rumors of the town no longer mattered, only the truth, waiting in silence between them. The photo. Night wrapped the house in quiet shadows. Martha sat alone at the kitchen table, the clock ticking steadily beside her. A single lamp flickered above her head, casting a warm circle of light on the table. In front of her lay an old photo album she hadn't opened in years. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the fragile cover. The pages smelled faintly of dust and time. One by one, she turned through decades of birthdays, holidays, and smiling faces. Her heart swelled with both comfort and sorrow. Then she stopped. A photo caught her breath. Her son Michael, aged 10, holding a toy car beside their old porch. A thin scar cut across his eyebrow, barely visible but unmistakable. Her eyes widened, her hand rising to her lips. She thought of David, that same scar, that same brow, the same quiet way of holding his hands. Her pulse quickened, her throat tightened. It couldn't be. The mind plays tricks, she told herself. Still, the thought refused to leave. She traced her fingers across the boy's face, whispering his name, Michael. From the living room came the faint sound of movement. David was there, mending a loose chair leg. The soft scrape of sandpaper against wood echoed through the still air. Martha peered through the doorway and watched him. The lamplight flickered across his face. He looked older, yes, but not a stranger. She saw her late husband in the curve of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands. For a moment, her breath caught again. She wanted to call his name, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she walked in quietly, carrying a cup of tea. "You've been working too long," she said. "You should rest." David smiled faintly. "I like fixing things, makes me feel useful." His tone carried both gratitude and sadness. He accepted the tea, his hands trembling slightly as their fingers brushed. The moment lingered, something unspoken moving between them. "Were you always this handy?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I used to run a small business, before everything fell apart." Her eyes met his, but he looked away. There was truth hiding in the shadows of that simple statement. When he left the room, Martha returned to the table. The photo album still lay open, the smiling boy frozen in time. She closed it slowly, tears glimmering in her eyes. The truth she had denied now pressed against her heart like a weight. If he was her son, what had become of him all these years? What had turned him from a boy full of promise into a man who slept in the cold? The wind outside moaned softly against the windows. She whispered into the silence, "Lord, if this is him, let me forgive before I know." Then she blew out the lamp, leaving the room in gentle darkness. The photo remained on the table, open to the face of a boy who had never truly left home. The confession that never comes. Days drifted by quietly after that night. Martha continued her daily routines, the cooking, the cleaning, the morning walks. Yet every moment carried a new weight, a silent awareness she couldn't shake. David moved about the house with gentle care, his every gesture filled with quiet gratitude. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice carried a kind of sorrow too deep to name. They existed like two souls walking the same path, but afraid to meet in the middle. Each morning, he chopped wood in the yard, while Martha watched from the kitchen window. The rhythm of his axe struck something deep inside her, familiar, steady, heartbreakingly known. Once, her husband had done the same, teaching their son how to split logs with patience, not anger. She could almost hear the echo of laughter from decades ago. The memory made her eyes sting. When David came inside, she hid her tears by pretending to dust the shelves. One afternoon, he found her standing before an old mantel clock. The clock had been silent since her husband's funeral. David examined it, then took it apart with delicate precision. Within minutes, a soft ticking filled the air again. The sound startled her, that slow, steady beat she had missed for 30 years. When she asked how he managed it, he only said, "It just needed a bit of care." Her throat tightened. "You have your father's hands," she murmured without realizing. He froze, looking at her, confusion flickering across his face. She smiled quickly to cover the slip. "I mean skilled hands, steady ones." He nodded, still studying her as if searching for something behind her eyes. That evening, Martha left an old photograph on the kitchen table. Her son's face, frozen in youth. It wasn't an accident. She wanted to see what David would do. The next morning, the photograph was gone. Her pulse quickened, a mix of dread and strange anticipation. By afternoon, she found it back in its place, now cleaned, dusted, and slipped neatly into a small wooden frame. David never mentioned it, neither did she, but that small act spoke louder than any confession could. At dinner, silence filled the room thicker than the smell of soup. David finally said, "You remind me of someone I used to know." Her spoon paused midair. "Do I?" she asked softly. He nodded, staring into the steam rising between them. "Someone who loved me when I didn't deserve it." Her eyes glistened, but she forced a smile. "You must have been loved very much." He didn't reply, only bowed his head. The ticking clock filled the gap where truths should have been. Later, when he had gone to bed, Martha sat alone beneath the lamplight. She whispered to the empty room, "He knows and so do I," but neither would say the words first. Forgiveness hovered between them like a fragile bird alive, but afraid to land. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake erasing the marks of yesterday's pain. Inside, two hearts waited in silence, both knowing the truth that love had quietly returned home. The visit from the past. The morning began like any other, quiet, still, and wrapped in the scent of coffee and pine. Martha stood by the window watching the street, her thoughts heavy but calm. David was outside, mending the fence that separated her yard from the road. His movements were slow and thoughtful, the way a man works when he's trying to make peace with himself. The sun rose weakly through the fog, turning the world pale gold. Everything felt almost normal again until the knock came at the door. Martha turned, startled. Through the frosted glass, she saw a figure, a young woman in a government coat, holding a clipboard. When she opened the door, the woman smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am. My name's Sarah Collins. I'm with Multnomah County Social Services." Martha's stomach tightened. "Is something wrong?" Sarah hesitated, glancing down at her notes. "I'm looking for a man named David Morgan. We've been trying to locate him for several months." The name hung heavy in the air. Martha gripped the edge of the door. "What for?" Sarah's tone softened. "He went missing from a recovery shelter downtown. He has some history, ma'am. We just want to make sure he's safe." David appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. The social worker turned toward him. "Mr. Morgan?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She seemed relieved but cautious. "You've been hard to find. We were worried. There's also," she paused, lowering her voice, "a note on your record about a fraud conviction from years back. I just need to confirm your current residence." Martha's heart clenched. Fraud. The word echoed through her mind like a bell. David's shoulders sagged. He said nothing, only looked down at the floor. After the worker left, silence swallowed the house. Martha stood by the fireplace, her hands trembling slightly. David spoke first. "I should have told you." She shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything." He sat down, his voice low. "I wasn't a bad man, Martha. I was desperate. My company was dying, and I forged a document so my employees could get paid. The court didn't care about the reason." She listened, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I lost everything," he continued. "My home, my family, myself." His words broke apart in the air, each one weighted with shame. Martha turned to him slowly. The firelight softened her face, making her look almost like she did decades ago. "Even the best men lose their way," she said quietly. "It's what you do afterward that matters." David looked up, his eyes full of disbelief. "You're not afraid of me?" She shook her head. "You're already punishing yourself more than the law ever could." Her tone carried no judgment, only weary understanding. He bowed his head, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Outside, a thin rain began to fall again, tapping gently on the windows. Inside, the two of them sat in fragile silence. Martha could see in his face both the broken man he'd become and the boy she once held in her arms, but she still couldn't say the word son. Not yet. The truth hovered, waiting for the right moment to be born, and as the fire burned lower, she whispered to herself, "He's come home, Lord, even if he doesn't know it." The winter storm. Winter came early that year. By mid-December, the sky hung low and heavy, the color of steel. The first snow arrived silently, coating rooftops and roads in white. Martha woke to a draft cutting through her old windows. Her joints ached as she rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. When she coughed, the sound rattled in her chest. David noticed immediately. "You should stay in bed today," he said, voice firm yet gentle. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "There's soup to make." But as the day went on, her strength faded. She stumbled once, catching herself on the table. David hurried over, alarm flashing across his face. He guided her to the couch, fetched a blanket, and tucked it around her tightly. "You're burning up," he muttered. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Just a cold." Still, he wouldn't leave her side. He stoked the fire, brewed tea with honey, and stayed awake through the night. Each time she dozed, she murmured in her sleep sometimes names, sometimes fragments of prayers, and once, in a trembling whisper, she said, "Michael, don't go." The words struck him like thunder. He froze, staring at her pale face. The name echoed inside his mind, painfully familiar. He sat beside her, holding her hand until morning. When sunlight finally touched the room, Martha stirred. Her fever had broken, though her voice was weak. She saw him watching her and smiled softly. "Thank you," he nodded, unable to speak. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and endless. Inside, warmth returned not just from the fire, but from something wordless between them. Days passed like that. David refused to leave, chopping wood, cooking meals, even mending her worn quilt. The neighbors, once suspicious, began to visit with food and medicine. "Bless your heart, Martha," they said. "You found yourself a guardian angel." She smiled at the phrase, though she knew the truth was far more complicated. One evening, she awoke to find David sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. His eyes glistened, his lips moving silently in prayer. She didn't interrupt, only listened to the faint crackle of wood. In that quiet, she realized both of them had been lost for years, searching for the same peace. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally ended, the world outside was hushed and new. David stepped onto the porch, breathing in the frozen air. For the first time, he smiled. He turned back toward the window, where Martha sat watching him. They shared a look that said everything words could not: gratitude, understanding, and something dangerously close to love. That night, as snow drifted past the window, the house no longer felt haunted. It felt like home. The letter. A week passed after the storm, and calm returned to the town. The air was crisp, the snow along the fence glittering like powdered glass. Martha sat by the window, her knitting resting half-finished in her lap. The room was warm, filled with the steady rhythm of the clock, and the faint smell of stew. David had gone to fetch supplies from the store. She was alone until a soft thump at the door broke the silence. When she opened it, she found an envelope on the porch. The paper was yellowed, the edges curled by time. Her name was written on it in a shaky, familiar hand to Mom. Martha's heart stopped. She carried it to the table as if it was something sacred. For a long time, she simply stared at it, afraid to open it. Finally, she tore the seal with trembling fingers. The letter inside was brief, but every word cut deep. It was dated 30 years ago. "I'm sorry for what I said, Mom. I was angry and foolish. I'll come back when I'm someone you can be proud of." The ink had faded, but the pain was still fresh. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the familiar handwriting. "Michael, her son." She pressed the paper to her chest and began to sob quietly. Outside, the wind rose, whispering against the glass, like a voice trying to reach her. A knock startled her again. David stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. He noticed the letter instantly and froze. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze locked on the paper in her trembling hand. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, another envelope, almost identical. He stared at it for a long moment, then walked outside. Martha followed him onto the porch, the cold air biting at her cheeks. David knelt by the fire pit, struck a match, and set his letter aflame. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges into glowing embers. He watched the paper turn to ash, his eyes wet but resolute. Martha said nothing. She stepped beside him and held her letter close. Together, they watched the smoke rise into the gray sky. In that moment, no words were needed. The firelight flickered across their faces, warming the tears that fell. 2 letters, 2 confessions burned away 30 years of distance. Martha reached out and touched his arm lightly. He looked at her, uncertain, searching her expression. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "Some things are meant to find their way home." The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Inside the house, the kettle whistled, calling them back to warmth. Neither spoke of the letters again, but from that night forward, both knew that forgiveness had already begun to live between them. The farewell attempt. Spring sunlight filtered through the curtains, scattering across the worn wooden floor. The air smelled of rain and new grass, but something inside the house felt heavier than ever. David stood by the doorway with a small bag at his feet. Martha watched from her chair, her knitting untouched. "You don't have to go," she said softly, though her voice wavered. He smiled faintly. "You've done enough for me. I can't keep taking." His tone was calm, but she saw the storm behind his eyes. He wasn't leaving out of choice, he was fleeing from the weight of truth. He bent down to tie the fraying laces of his shoes. The gesture reminded her so painfully of her son that her throat closed. She wanted to stop him, to speak the truth at last, but fear held her still. Instead, she forced a smile. "At least stay until Sunday. The church is serving lunch." He hesitated, then nodded, eyes lowered. That small agreement gave her a sliver of time, one more chance. As he packed, she prepared extra meals, telling herself it was habit, but deep down, she knew it was goodbye. Food the kind a mother makes when she knows her child is leaving forever. That evening, the town glowed under the first warmth of spring. Martha carried her basket of meals back to the station, her pace slower now. David followed a few steps behind, silent. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few familiar faces. She handed out sandwiches and thermoses, the same as she had for years. But this time, her hands shook. She could feel the moment coming, something final and irreversible. When the food was gone, David turned to leave. Martha called out, "David." But her voice cracked. He stopped, his back to her. For a moment, she saw her son standing there, the same shoulders, the same posture, the same loneliness. Her heart couldn't take it anymore. The name escaped her lips in a whisper. "Michael." He froze. Slowly, he turned, disbelief and shock washing over his face. The wind stilled, even the trains seemed to pause. "What did you say?" he asked, voice barely audible. Tears filled her eyes as she stepped closer. "Michael, my boy." He staggered backward, shaking his head, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. The truth hit them both like thunder, too heavy, too real. Martha reached out, her hands trembling. He stared at her for a long, broken moment, then collapsed into her arms. She held him tightly, her tears falling onto his shoulder. Years of silence, shame, and distance melted in that embrace. People nearby stopped to watch but said nothing. The wind carried the faint sound of the train whistle in the distance. Neither of them spoke, they didn't need to. The mother who never stopped waiting had finally found her son, and the man who thought he'd lost everything had finally come home. The town's witness. By morning, word had spread through the small town like wildfire. The old woman who fed the homeless had found her long-lost son. At the diner, people whispered over coffee cups, their disbelief slowly softening into awe. Even those who had once mocked her now spoke her name with respect. "Martha Jenkins," they said, "the woman who never gave up." Outside her house, the street was unusually quiet. David stood on the porch, looking out over the neighborhood. The world seemed brighter, cleaner, as though spring itself had been waiting for this moment. Martha joined him, her hand resting gently on his arm. He glanced down at her, eyes still red from the night before. Neither spoke, their silence had enough. Pastor Miller arrived first, his car crunching softly over the gravel. He stepped out carrying a small bouquet of daisies. "God works in his own time," he said warmly, handing the flowers to Martha. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Yes, Pastor, he surely does." Behind him came neighbors with casseroles, pies, and awkward smiles. No one apologized for their gossip. Instead, they offered kindness. Martha accepted it all graciously, her heart too full for anger. Later, the townspeople gathered outside the church for Sunday service. David followed Martha inside, his head bowed. The sanctuary fell silent as they entered together. For a brief moment, everyone simply stared. Then the pastor spoke. "Today we witness grace made visible." He gestured toward them, and the congregation rose in applause. Some clapped, others wept openly. David looked at the floor, humbled beyond words. Martha squeezed his hand and whispered, "Lift your head, son. After the service, children ran up to him, tugging his sleeve. "You're Miss Martha's boy," one exclaimed, grinning. David laughed, a sound Martha hadn't heard in years. It was warm and unguarded. The sound filled her chest with something she hadn't felt in decades: peace. Outside, the town bell rang 12 times, echoing across the valley. People lingered to talk, to shake hands, to share stories. The walls that had divided them for years began to crumble. That evening, Martha sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. David worked quietly in the yard, repairing the old birdhouse her husband once made. She watched him, her eyes soft, her soul steady. He looked up, catching her gaze, and smiled faintly. It was the same smile her son had as a boy: gentle, shy, full of hope. The past no longer felt like a wound. The town no longer felt like a cage. And for the first time in 30 years, the Jenkins home was filled with laughter instead of silence. The new beginning. The days after their reunion felt different, lighter somehow. Martha no longer walked to the train station alone. David joined her every morning, carrying the basket she once struggled to lift. The same faces greeted them, the same hungry eyes, but now there was laughter too. People began to call them the Jenkins pair. Even the local newspaper printed a small story: mother and son reunited through kindness. The photograph showed them side by side, smiling shyly at the camera. At first, Martha was embarrassed by the attention. She had never sought recognition. She simply wanted to feed those in need. But now, something new was growing inside her: hope. David suggested they expand her work into something lasting. "We could open a small kitchen," he said. "Not charity, community." Martha smiled, touched by the idea. He began sketching plans on scraps of paper, his old business instincts flickering to life. She watched him, pride swelling quietly in her chest. The man who once lost everything now wanted to give everything back, and she who had spent years mourning found purpose again in his renewal. Within weeks, the townspeople began helping. The church donated supplies, a carpenter offered to repair an old shed, and teenagers came after school to paint. David led the work with calm efficiency, earning respect even from those who once whispered behind his back. Martha cooked for everyone, her laughter filling the space where hammers struck wood. By early summer, the shed had transformed into a small but warm kitchen. The first sign went up above the door: the Sunday table, everyone welcome. Martha cried when she saw it. David stood beside her, arm around her shoulder. "It's your dream, Mom," he said softly. She shook her head. "No, son, it's ours." When they opened, people came: not just the homeless, but the lonely, the widowed, the forgotten. Some came for food, others just to talk. Laughter replaced gossip, and kindness replaced judgment. The town that once turned its back now came together around one long table. Martha served soup while David poured coffee, and together, they watched strangers become neighbors. Outside, children played near the porch, their voices bright against the hum of conversation. For the first time, Martha felt her life had come full circle. The pain that had once defined her was gone, replaced by peace. As dusk fell and the kitchen lights glowed softly against the evening sky, she whispered to herself, "This is what home was meant to be." The interview. By midsummer, the Sunday table had become more than a soup kitchen. It had become a movement. Every Sunday, the line outside wrapped around the block. Families came not just for food, but for belonging. Laughter drifted from the open windows, mixing with the scent of soup and fresh bread. What began as one woman's kindness had become the heartbeat of the town. One morning, a shiny black car pulled up near the entrance. A woman stepped out, heels clicking on the pavement, holding a microphone. Her cameraman followed with a tripod slung over his shoulder. She introduced herself with a practiced smile. "I'm Claire Reynolds, Channel 7 News. We're here to tell your story." Martha blinked, startled. "Oh, I were just serving lunch," she said shyly, but the reporter only smiled wider. "That's exactly what makes it beautiful." Inside, cameras captured every detail: the steaming pots, the chatter, the children helping with trays. David stayed in the background at first, uncomfortable under the lens. When the reporter asked for his name, he hesitated. "Martha's helper," he said quietly. But Claire wasn't fooled. "You're her son, aren't you? The one everyone's talking about?" The room went silent. David nodded slowly, his voice low. "Yes, Mom. Her son who forgot who he was for a long time." The cameraman's eyes softened as he filmed. Martha tried to deflect the attention, fussing over the soup, yet Claire insisted on hearing more. "How did this all begin?" she asked. Martha looked at her hands, folded tightly together. "It began with a bowl of stew," she said, "and a promise I made to my husband before he died, that I'd never stop feeding those who are hungry." Her voice trembled, but she kept smiling. "Turns out," she added, glancing at David, "one of the hungry souls was my own boy." The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Claire lowered her microphone, visibly moved. Tears shimmered in the eyes of the volunteers. For a long moment, no one spoke, only the simmer of soup filled the silence. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The sound grew louder until it filled the entire room. Martha laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "Oh, mercy," she whispered. "I didn't mean to make a scene." A week later, the story aired across the state. The headline read, "Love Finds Its Way Home. The Grandmother and the Lost Son Who Feed a Town." Letters poured in from across the country, messages of gratitude, hope, and forgiveness. Some offered donations, others simply wrote, "You reminded me of my mother." David read each one aloud to Martha, who listened with misty eyes and a proud smile. She said softly, "Seems the Lord had a bigger plan than I ever did." David nodded, his voice quiet but sure. "He always does, Mom. He always does." The weight of fame. The days after the broadcast felt unreal. Letters flooded the mailbox, packages arrived from strangers, and the phone rang non-stop. Some people sent donations, others sent prayers written on folded stationery. The story of the Sunday table had touched hearts far beyond Portland. For a brief moment, the quiet town became famous. At first, Martha was overwhelmed but grateful. She read every letter, crying over words from people she'd never met. One note read, "I haven't spoken to my mother in years. Your story made me call her." Another simply said, "Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't expire." She pinned them on the kitchen wall, until the wallpaper disappeared beneath the paper hearts. David, however, grew uneasy. Reporters began showing up without notice, snapping photos of the kitchen and filming their customers. He hated the flashing lights, the way strangers turned their pain into spectacle. When one journalist asked for his life story, he froze. He still carried the shame of his past like a second shadow. The headlines spoke of redemption, but he still remembered the cold of the prison cell, and the silence of the nights he'd spent alone. To him, forgiveness was a gift he didn't know how to wear. Martha noticed his discomfort and tried to protect him. She told reporters she was too tired for more interviews. "We're just feeding people," she'd say with a polite smile. "That's all there is." Still, fame crept in through the cracks. People began to donate more than they could use. Checks arrived with notes like, "For your ministry," and "For the Miracle Family." David wanted to refuse it all, but Martha said softly, "We'll use it for good." That night, as rain fell outside, David sat by the window staring into the dark. "I don't deserve any of this," he said quietly. Martha, sitting beside him, placed her hand over his. "Maybe not," she answered gently, "but grace isn't about deserving." He looked at her, eyes full of questions he couldn't voice. Her face was calm, lit by the warm glow of the lamp. "You gave me back my son," she said. "Let the world see what forgiveness looks like." He turned away, trying to hide the tears in his eyes. Outside, lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the wet streets. Inside, Martha rose and covered the windows, dimming the glare of the world. She returned to the table, her steps slow but steady. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll feed twice as many." David nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Mom." And as the rain eased into silence, both of them understood. Kindness always carried a weight, but love was strong enough to bear it. The promise, the first hint of autumn had returned. Cool mornings, orange leaves, and the smell of pine smoke drifting through town. The Sunday table was thriving, every bench filled, every heart warmed by the kindness that began in one woman's kitchen. But Martha had begun to slow down. Her hands, once steady with the ladle, now trembled slightly. David noticed before she said a word. "You should rest more," he said one morning, his voice gentle. She smiled, brushing him off. "I'll rest when the pots stop boiling." But her breath came shorter these days, and the long hours took their toll. One afternoon, she nearly fainted while serving soup. David caught her just in time, steadying her with both hands. The room went still. Volunteers rushed forward, worry etched across their faces. Martha straightened, insisting she was fine. Just lightheaded, that's all. But David saw the truth: she was fading, quietly and gracefully. That night, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in the same quilt he'd mended during the winter storm. The stars above were sharp and bright against the black sky. Crickets sang, and a train whistle sounded in the distance. The same sound that had once torn their lives apart, now oddly comforting. Martha's voice was soft when she spoke. "Promise me something, Michael." He turned to her, startled at the name. She hadn't said it since the night of their reunion. "Anything," he whispered. "Promise me you'll keep this place alive," she said, eyes glistening. "Not for me, but for them." He swallowed hard. "I will," she smiled, her hand finding his. "Feed them like you feed your own soul. Don't ever stop." Her words trembled in the cool night air. "I won't," he said. "I swear it." They sat in silence, hands entwined, the sound of the wind moving through the trees. In the weeks that followed, Martha began training the younger volunteers, passing down her recipes, her patience, and her laughter. David handled the finances, the deliveries, the logistics, but always left the first ladle of soup to her. "This is your blessing," he'd say. She'd nod, smiling tiredly, knowing time was slipping through her fingers. Yet there was peace in her eyes now, not fear. On her last day at the kitchen, the townspeople surprised her with a celebration. Candles lined the tables, and the children she once fed brought flowers. When they sang for her, she cried openly, unashamed. She looked at David and whispered, "We did it, son." He squeezed her hand. "No, Mom, you did." She laughed softly. "Then you'll have to finish it for me." That evening, as the crowd dispersed, Martha sat by the door, watching the light fade. She closed her eyes, her face peaceful in the glow of the lanterns. The promise hung in the air like a prayer, and when David looked at her, he knew her work would never end. Not as long as someone was hungry, and someone remembered her name. Final morning. The morning came quietly, soft and golden, like a whispered goodbye. Sunlight crept through the lace curtains, painting delicate patterns across the quilt. The house was still, save for the faint tick of the mantel clock. David woke early, as always, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen, but the stove was cold, the pots untouched. A chill ran through him. "Martha?" he called softly. No answer. He walked to her room, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. She lay peacefully on her bed, hands folded, the faintest smile upon her lips. The morning light kissed her silver hair. For a moment, he thought she was simply sleeping. Then he saw the stillness, a stillness too perfect, too final. He knelt beside her, his breath caught in his throat. "Mom," he whispered. The word broke like glass in his mouth. Tears came without warning. He took her hand, still warm, still hers. It felt unreal that the woman who had carried him through every mistake, every shame, had quietly gone before dawn. Beside her bed sat her worn Bible, open to a bookmarked verse. He read the underlined words through blurred eyes. "Well done, good and faithful servant." His voice trembled as he whispered them aloud. Outside, the first train of the morning rumbled in the distance, the sound echoing through the valley. It no longer sounded lonely, only steady, like a heartbeat, continuing on her behalf. The townspeople gathered when they heard. The news spread not through television or headlines, but through tears and stories. Pastor Miller came first, followed by neighbors, volunteers, and even strangers who'd once eaten at her table. They filled the small house with flowers, prayers, and quiet gratitude. David stood at the doorway, unable to speak, his grief vast but strangely calm. He greeted each person with a nod, his mother's strength guiding him. That evening, the sun dipped low over the churchyard. Martha's casket rested beneath the old oak tree, surrounded by blooms of yellow daffodils, her favorite. The choir sang softly, their voices rising like wind through the branches. David stepped forward to speak, his hands shaking as he unfolded a single note. "She taught me," he began, "that love doesn't end when someone leaves. It changes shape. It becomes what we give to others." His voice broke, but he continued, "She found me when I was lost, and she taught me that forgiveness is not a word. It's a meal you share, every single day." He looked toward the kitchen window of the church hall, where volunteers were already serving soup to the mourners. Steam rose into the cool air like a blessing. And for the first time, David smiled through his tears. He knew she was still there, in the warmth, in the laughter, in every bowl of stew handed with love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the church bell rang once, then twice, echoing across the quiet town, and somewhere deep inside him, he felt her whisper, "Keep your promise, my boy." He turned toward the kitchen and walked back inside. Tomorrow, he would open the Sunday table again, not in grief, but in gratitude, because her final morning was not an ending. It was a beginning that would never fade. The legacy lives on. A year had passed since Martha's final morning, yet her presence lingered in every corner of the town. The Sunday table stood at the heart of it, all fresh paint on the walls, flowers by the door, laughter spilling from inside. David kept his promise. Every Sunday, he opened the doors at sunrise, just as she once did, whispering the same prayer she used to say, "May no one leave hungry today." Her photo hung near the entrance, framed in oak and sunlight. People often paused before it, some bowing their heads, others simply smiling. To newcomers, she was a legend, a grandmother who turned kindness into a movement. To David, she was still just Mom. He spoke to her each morning as he stirred the first pot of stew. "Morning, Mom. Hope I'm doing this right," he'd murmur with a faint smile. The town had changed. Where once there had been judgment, now there was generosity. The diner owner donated bread every week. Local farmers brought crates of vegetables. High school students volunteered after class, learning. That service was a kind of love. Even the mayor visited one Sunday, ladling soup with rolled-up sleeves and laughter in his eyes. Martha's spirit had become the town's quiet rhythm, guiding their hands and softening their hearts. David no longer hid from the world. He spoke openly about his past when visitors asked why he did this work. "I was lost," he would say simply, "but love found me again." People listened not because his story was tragic, but because it was true. In that honesty, they found courage for their own broken pieces. One afternoon, as he cleaned up after a long day, a little girl approached him. She held out a crumpled paper heart colored with crayons. "This is for your mom," she said shyly. "She fed my grandpa when he didn't have a home." David knelt, accepting it like a sacred gift. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll make sure she gets it." He pinned it beside Martha's photograph, next to hundreds of letters and notes that filled the wall like a patchwork of gratitude. As twilight fell, David stepped outside, leaning against the doorway. The air was cool, and the distant whistle of a train carried through the hills. He looked up at the fading light and felt a strange peace. The grief that once hollowed him now glowed gently inside, a reminder, not a wound. He smiled, whispering to the wind, "You were right, Mom. Love doesn't end." The last customers left, waving goodbye under the porch light. David locked the door, the sign swaying softly in the evening breeze, "The Sunday table, everyone welcome." He turned off the lights, but the warmth inside remained, carried in every memory, every act of kindness yet to come. As he walked home through the quiet street, he passed the train station, where it had all begun. The bench was empty now, bathed in soft lamplight. He paused, laid a small thermos of stew on the seat, and smiled. Then he whispered, "For whoever needs it next." The empty bench. Dawn broke over Portland with a quiet softness, the kind that made the world feel new. The first train of the day roared faintly in the distance, its echo bouncing through the valley. David walked the familiar path toward the station, the air crisp and silver with morning mist. He carried a small basket, not full, just one meal, carefully wrapped. Inside it was a bowl of stew and a slice of bread, exactly how his mother used to serve it. The station looked almost the same as it had years ago. The wooden benches glistened with dew, the old clock above the platform ticking faithfully. A few early travelers huddled under scarves, waiting for their trains. David found the spot, her spot, at the far end of the bench near the lamp post. It was the place where she had first handed him food without judgment, where everything had begun. He sat down slowly, placing the basket beside him. For a long while, he said nothing, just listened to the faint hum of life awakening around him. The world seemed smaller without her voice in it, but somehow warmer, too. He could almost hear her humming that old hymn she used to sing while cooking. He smiled faintly. "You'd tell me to stop crying and feed someone, wouldn't you, Mom?" His breath fogged in the cold air. He glanced at the basket, then stood, leaving it on the bench. Across the platform, A man in worn clothes hesitated, watching him. David nodded to him, silent invitation. The man approached slowly, uncertain. When he lifted the lid and saw the food, his eyes widened. He looked up to thank David, but David had already stepped back toward the street. He didn't need thanks, only the continuation of her kindness. As he walked away, sunlight broke through the fog, bathing the station in gold. The man sat down on the bench, eating quietly, steam rising from the stew. David turned once more, watching from a distance. For a moment, he saw his mother sitting there instead, her scarf fluttering, her smile soft and proud. The vision faded, but the warmth remained. He whispered, "I kept my promise." The train whistle blew, echoing through the morning air. David closed his eyes, letting the sound carry him back to every memory, every prayer, every meal, every quiet act of grace. Then he turned toward town, the wind at his back, the scent of stew lingering in the air. The bench behind him glowed in the sunlight, empty yet full, a quiet monument to love that never stopped feeding the world. Letters of gratitude. Years passed, and the story of the Sunday table became part of the town's history. No longer news, but memory. The small kitchen still stood at the edge of Main Street, its windows glowing every Sunday morning. The same aroma of stew filled the air, drawing people in from all walks of life. Children who once came for food, now brought their own children to serve beside David. Martha's name lived on each apron, embroidered in simple thread. Feed with love. The postman still brought letters every week, though most were now addressed to the Jenkins Foundation. Some came from nearby towns, others from faraway states. Many began the same way: "You don't know me, but your story changed my life." David read them every evening after closing, his hands steady, his eyes glistening with pride. He never answered all of them, there were too many, but he kept each one. He stacked them neatly in wooden boxes, labeled by year, as if collecting pieces of his mother's everlasting conversation with the world. One letter stood out. It was written in a child's handwriting, the ink smudged by small fingers. "Dear Mr. David, my mom says you and your mom saved our family. We have food now, but we still make soup every Sunday. We call it Martha's Day." David smiled, pressing the letter against his chest. He could almost hear his mother laughing, that quiet, knowing laugh she used to have when goodness returned in unexpected ways. At the next service, Pastor Miller invited David to speak at the pulpit. He held a bundle of those letters in his hands. His voice shook at first but grew stronger with every word. "These," he said, lifting the stack, "are proof that one bowl of soup can outlive us all." The congregation listened in silence, tears shining under the church lights. He continued softly, "My mother taught me that love is never wasted. It travels, it multiplies, it finds its way home." His voice cracked on the last word, and a murmur of quiet amens filled the room. After the service, he placed the letters in a glass case near the entrance, a small plaque beneath them. "Read letters of gratitude, seeds of kindness, planted by Martha Jenkins." Visitors stopped to read them, some smiling, some crying. David watched from afar, feeling the circle complete itself once more. That night, as he closed the kitchen, he lit a candle by her photograph. The flame flickered gently, reflecting off the letters on the wall. He whispered, "You kept teaching, Mom." Even without words. Outside, a breeze swept through town, rustling the trees and the paper hearts on the wall, and in that whispering wind, he could almost hear her voice, soft, eternal, and proud. "Good job, my boy. Keep feeding them."